In the past 3 weeks I've created a paradox form for all the second stage Pseudo Legendaries. Each of them got both a future and a past form. Today I'll be showing you all the 20 forms I made. The first transformation is for Dragonair, and we're going to start with its past form. We of course already had a huge guideline we could follow, which was the design we made for Dratini, Flaring Hood. We did however begin with a shape study, and I must say that we were able to get it to look good quite quickly. This was definitely a much easier process compared to the first stage. Once the body of regular Dragonair was in, it was time to turn it into a fierce looking snake. We started with the modification of the top part of his body into a cobra-like width. This bigger body made it look unbalanced though, so we made sure to make his head bigger too. We then gave him some makeup next to his eye, and we brought back his rattlesnake tail element. We also gave him some skeletal bone spikes on his back, which functions to make him look more deadly and scary. Even though we added these features, he still looked quite cute and friendly. We figured out that it was due to the lack of a menacing looking mouth. We fixed this by giving him a strong jaw, so he can still bite his foes with even more strength than his predecessor. The last things we did for the design were to make his horn a lot spikier, added some spikes to the rattle on his tail, and tweaked the wings on his head into feral versions of themselves. For the colors we used the same blue of regular Dragonair, but we did bring back the purple of the first stage to play into the part poison typing. Bulking Venom. This Pokemon is very resilient to venomous attacks, and due to its muscular body, it doesn't have to rely only on biting and can instead deal powerful attacks by whipping its tail. If Bulking Venom sinks its teeth into you, it will inject a lethal toxin that can be fatal to any organism in a matter of minutes. I think this line has a lot of potential to become something incredible, but I'm not yet sure how Dragonite will fit into this line. For this piece we decided to stay a bit closer to the original Pokemon than we did for our previous piece. Luckily the shape study went by pretty nicely, and we were able to drop down a sketch that actually looked like a Dragonair. When it was time to add our futuristic elements, I made the decision to not only make it into a robotic version of itself, but I wanted to expand that concept. I managed to do so by adding a big fuel tank in the middle segment of his body. Oh yeah, that is of course what we did. We added a bunch of segments breaking up the main body into a few different parts. We also transformed the tip of his tail into a hose to give him an extra way of delivering the fuel he's carrying around. Another thing we changed were his eyes into actual screen ones, literally the thing we do for almost every future form. Another thing we changed were the wings on the side of his head. We made sure to make them feel a lot more robotic and took huge inspiration from the first Pokemon in this line. This also resulted in a mouthpiece coming back to the design, because I wanted to keep that trend going for it. Last but not least, we added a bunch of segment lines to the back parts of the segments. The color of the lighted part remained yellow to keep it as an electric type. Iron Carrier. This Pokemon is a sentient fuel tank designed for transporting a strong fuel source for rocket ships and other large spacecrafts. It can empty its fuel by plugging in a tube from Iron Carrier's neck to directly fill the machine that needs it. It refills its own fuel source over time by absorbing any energy around it and converting it into its own. I am really happy with this design. It definitely feels like I was able to combine both the Dragonair and the Prevolution design. I will start out by saying that I genuinely got lost in the drawing process for this piece. It was quite difficult to come up with ways to bring back the first stage into this piece. This was mainly because Pupitar is completely different compared to Larvitar. Before I tell you what the struggles were on the design itself, I want to point out that I also had an extremely hard time with the recreation of the pose. I've noticed that it is insanely hard for me to draw Pokemon that consist of a lot of square 3D shapes, instead of being able to get away with some easy spheres. Once I did finally manage to make a pose that got close to the actual looks of Pupitar, it took me quite a long time to figure out which paradox details I wanted to bring back into it. In the end we only added a nose horn and a small sharp looking mouth right under it. We did this because we came up with the idea of basing this design a little bit of those tiki masks. You might argue that it currently just doesn't change enough, and you might actually be right, but my way of dealing with this point was to completely change the color palette to fit the first stage better. We used all the colors from Larvitar, but made sure to put a lot more emphasis on the bone part of its design. Fearless Skull. This Pokemon uses bones it collects to create a mask to scare off other predators. Even as a pupa, Fearless Skull is still very violent and doesn't need an excuse to cause havoc to everything in its surroundings. At first I wasn't a big fan of this design, but now that I look back at it while writing the script, it has actually grown on me quite hard. It's a simple change, but it does make it look a lot more menacing, which is awesome. This was one of those designs where you release all of the frustration of not being able to put down the drawings the way you want them to, because this design itself was a breeze. This pose was a bit more forgiving on the department of the square 3D shapes, and made it possible to start on the actual design quite quickly. We started out by adding a bunch of segment lines all around his body, and we added in a lighted part on the middle of his chest. We also gave him some small teeth looking things, because I felt like this was necessary in order to place this design between our Iron Crunch and the real Iron Thorns. The color palette did change drastically compared to Pupitar, but was actually exactly the same as its previous stage. I do want to quickly mention that I picked up a small new detail for future forms, which is coloring the line art with a bit of white on certain places to make them seem extra reflective. I wasn't able to do that to every future form from this point, but I am using it more often now. Iron Cocoon. This Pokemon is very durable, so it stands in the front line to assist Iron Crunch in protecting old ruins where Iron Thorns resides. Surprisingly, they are the smartest of their evolution line, but they lose most of that intelligence when they evolve. Once again, another super basic change, but this color palette makes it look so freaking awesome. And it genuinely looks like it fits as a previous stage to Iron Thorns. This was another design where I figured I would have quite a lot of trouble due to the execution of the 3D shapes needing to be perfect. However, the drawing process went by easier than expected. His body is basically just a big sphere with some extended parts to show the different segments on his body. This made us not even have to do a secondary layer of line art for the minor details of the Pokemon, and that made us able to quickly start adding the details of Roaring Moon into the design. We started out by adding some makeup under his eyes and by giving him some sharp underbite teeth. Our next step was to give him some sharp toes, and we added some feathers to the top of his limbs. We also brought back the cheek fur from both the first and the final stage. The next big thing we did was to add a tail onto the design, which makes for a smoother transition as the middle stage he is. The last changes we made were to change his facial structure into a more rough and fierce looking one by simply turning his shell into eyebrows and by adding a nose. We also added back the yellow markings to the inner parts of his legs, and we followed it up by adding in the colors. We once again went with the color palette laid out by both the first and the last stage of this line. Rough shell. This Pokemon's shell is tough as steel with a rough surface. It has a hard time reaching out to bite foes, so it instead throws its large, heavy self at them. It spends most of its time eating and training, so it can evolve as soon as possible. I am once again super happy with this design. It definitely looks like Scaly Terror's evolution, and I will say that it will also make a past form of Salamence. But Nick, we already have Roaring Moon. What are you doing? I know, but Roaring Moon has drastic changes in his proportions. Don't get me wrong, Roaring Moon is awesome, but with having Salamence in my favorite team of 6, I have to draw him with the proportions I love so much. I didn't do anything crazy for this design. I wanted to keep it simple and just give it some interesting lore to place it into the direction of the first stage. Once the body and pose were ready, I only had to add some minor details like a lot of segment lines on his shell, the segmentation of his hind leg, the added toes on his front legs, and the one thing that was actually quite different, the addition of eyebrows. This feature made it able to add a lot more expression onto the drawing, and I think it fills up the empty middle part of his body quite well too. The last thing we added were some more segment lines onto the lighted parts on his shell, and it was time to play around with the colors. We only had two differences, which were the robotic grey colors and the blue color for his lighted parts. We did this to portray his water typing again. As you guys might know that the shiny future forms only get grayed out of their colors, but since he already had a grey color palette, we decided to make it into a dark ball of doom instead. Iron Orb. Despite looking heavy, Iron Orb is actually quite light with a layer of soft pads covering its body. It can inflate itself to the point where it can float on water. It can also open its shell to release 3 buoys that it has stored inside of itself. This makes it a very good Pokemon to take with you when traveling across the ocean. I can't wait to work on the evolution for this piece either. Imagine a mechanical form of Salamence. That is going to be fire. Or in this case, water. Even though this was another piece with a lot of 3D shapes involved, it actually went by decently easy. I will say that the shape study saved me a lot on this one, but the end result is still a bit wonky. A lot of my pieces are just a bit less perfect now that I don't trace anymore. But hey, that's what you call progress, I guess. Once we had the body down, it was time to add the pass form changes into the design. I didn't really do anything crazy. The main changes were just some wobbly inconsistencies for the line art, and at a certain point I did believe I overdone it, but that proved not to be the case once I put in the colors. We went for the same deserty color palette we gave the first stage, and made sure to have a few holes to show that this Pokemon is hollow at certain points. We did make sure to have another big hole on the top of his head to showcase the almost escaping energy in the middle of his body. So far this is definitely my favorite line out of the Pseudo Legendaries we've done, and I can't wait to see what the final evolution will look like. Righteous Rock. The yellow energy core in this Pokemon's body functions as a heart, brain, and a weapon, so it must protect it to keep itself alive. Righteous Rock has been dubbed the legendary guard of Hoenn, for it is always seen hovering around ancient towers and ruins. Though it can use its energy core as an attack, that does leave it exhausted and vulnerable for a while, so it only uses it when it truly feels it's necessary. I could 100% see myself jumping on the back of this creature and just traveling the world with it. I also still really like the inverted shiny colors we gave this line. In a video of the first stage of this line, I mentioned that I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep going in that direction for this entire line, but you guys showed that you actually liked the design of Iron Warbot. We did have some people who said it may have been a bit too much, and I agree with that statement, but you know, sometimes you just gotta have some fun, right? We of course started with another shape study, but instead of trying to build out the pose from the reference, I decided to make one of my own. I knew I would be able to do that for this piece, because it wouldn't really matter if it would turn out to be a little wonky. Because that is basically what this entire line is about. I did listen to the feedback of the wheel looking too much like a coin, so I swapped it into a ball to feel a bit sturdier. I know the pose might be a bit too symmetrical and front oriented, which Pokemon does not do themselves, but I do think that adds to the eerie feeling of this Pokemon. The colors remained completely the same, although I did consider adding a bunch more places for the lighted parts, but I wanted to stay true to the first stage and to the color palette of the line in general. The eyes remained red as well, but my chat did notice it started to look a bit too similar to a certain character out of Sesame Street. So here is Iron Elmo, the Paradox Pokemon! The original inventor of Iron Warbot never intended for it to evolve, but as their AI developed, they found out that they could use the parts of their fallen allies to upgrade themselves, evolving it into Iron Elmo. It is very destructive with its newly acquired power, and it is even seen turning on its own kind. Its one goal is to evolve once more into their final form by using a powerful component. It may not know exactly what that component is, but it will eventually find out. I am sorry I had to make it shiny into a red version to make it look even more like Elmo. Jeez, it's not even that funny. I know that's not how the paradox rules work, but Pokemon wouldn't make an Elmo look-alike either, so I think we're good on that department. Just like the first stage in this line, we're going to base this off of the beta sprite of Gabite. This is a drastic change in his proportions and body shape in general, but my goal is to combine elements from both designs into one. Once again we began with the study of his shapes, and we found out that his body is quite easy to make because it basically consists of two circular shapes and a few parts sticking out as his legs. The first thing we added for the paradox elements were the jet features on his head, and we made sure to bring back the shark-like nose. We then made sure to draw this in a way to make his eye look a lot fiercer as well. After this we gave him some teeth and extended the fin on the back of his head. We also gave him a large tail and made sure to bring back a lot of the features of Gabite's tail, like the stripes on them and the extra fin on the end of it. During all of these changes we repeatedly made small changes to his body and pose to make him feel more anatomically correct. The last things we added to the design were a hole on his forehead, the belly pattern, some spikes on his front legs, and we added a bunch of lines to emulate depth as if it was a piece of armor. The colors did change a little compared to the first form, but that's only because we're following the color palette of Gabite and not of Gibble. You might not recognize it too much as a Gabite right now, but with the colors we used for his shiny, you instantly see what we used as reference for this piece. Quaking Shark. This Pokemon spends most of its time digging tunnels through caves to expand its territory because the quaking shark with the most territory is considered the strongest out of all. If any Pokemon dares to step foot on its turf, it will not stop chasing them until they are eliminated, even going as far to wreck its own home. I actually really like this line. I get a lot of joy out of bringing back certain forms who we have either lost or have only been used once, like the spiked-eared Pichu for example. I actually tried something different for this piece, which was to gather all the basic shapes without adding in the details first. This made it quite a lot easier to replicate, because instead of having to look through all the details, I could now simply just focus on the easy shapes first. This made it able for me to simplify my sketching phase by a lot, and it genuinely felt a lot easier on my brain too. I must say that I was scared it wouldn't look good once I put in the details, but I was happily surprised to see it actually turned out to look really good. Now that the body was in, we started adding in the futuristic elements. We started out by blocking off his shoulders and hands to create an almost rubber-like texture for his arms. We then put our focus towards his head, and we added some eye sockets, a metal plate on the top of it, and we added back in the blaster elements on the jet features next to his head. After this we gave him some segments on both of his legs, and we added some segment lines to each of his toes as well. I will say that I once again took huge inspiration from the design of Iron Thorns, because we used the same technique for a segment line on the legs, plus we brought back the same elements for his belly area. Last but not least, we blocked off the fin on his tail, used a lot of segment lines to a lot of different areas of his body, added a section of lighted parts on his back fin, and did the same thing for the fins on his arms. The colors remained the same as Gabite, with the addition of the blue colors, which depicts the ice type of this line. We did once again use the reflective line art technique, and this minor detail once again improved this piece insanely much. Iron Beam. This Pokemon can extend its arms up to 3 meters long, and it uses its Sub-Zero blades on its hand to slide through anything with blinding speed. It is supposedly able to cut through diamonds, which they use to mine for pure ice and crystals that grow underground. If it gives you a piece of ice or crystal, that means it has a strong bond with you that won't be broken. Iron Beam isn't only skilled in melee combat, it also has precise aim when using the 2 blasters on the side of its head. I know I've said it many times before, but this is by far my best piece I've done yet. It has a lot of depth, and I am really getting a lot better at rendering as well. By the way, this is definitely one of the better shinies I've made too. I created a brush set with all my favorite brushes. I use each of them with every drawing that I make, so if you want to draw in the same style as me, I recommend checking out my website. For only €5.99, you can get the Procreate brush set, which you will be able to use in Procreate. It includes an amazing line art brush, a highlight brush which instantly makes your pieces look a lot better, and many other fantastic brushes. I also want to have a written down version of how to create Paradox Pokemon. That's why I created this step-by-step guide. It's easy to follow, and I added a bunch more tips you can use while drawing. You will also get the work files of the 2 Paradox Pokemon we created, and I added 2 work files with just a line art so you can practice coloring and shading. This guide is also available for €5.99 on my website, but since I thought you guys might be interested in buying it together with the brush set, I made it into a combi deal for only €8.99 for the both of them. That is a 25% discount, so I know what I would do. Up next is the past form for Zweilous. We once again only focused on recreating the easy to replicate shapes, like a lot of spheres and a few tubes connecting them to get a sense for the layout of the body. I still think this is unreal that this method works so incredibly well, that even a quadrupedal Pokemon is not even that hard anymore. This is definitely the thing I've struggled with the most, so I'm super happy we finally found a way to make them. After adding in the details on top of the easy shapes, we moved on to the past elements. We began by giving him a big dinosaur-like tail and gave him some sharp toenails on his hind legs. We then gave him some cheek feathers and we added roughed up feathers to the wings on his back. Someone in my chat gave me the idea to add a few chips in those feathers, which led us to go into the direction of a fallen angel. Our final change was to bring back the horns the first stage had too, and the colors remained the same, except for a few more extra purple details on the design. Fallen Angel. This Pokemon may have 2 consciousness, but that doesn't mean it's very intelligent. The 2 heads are always biting each other and arguing over every minor disagreement, sometimes one head fully knocking out the other one. They stumble and walk in circles as they share control over their legs, and they may just give up and stay sat down for the entire day. I wasn't really able to come up with more ideas to make this Pokemon look more interesting, or how to bring in more paradox elements into the design. I do still really like the Fallen Angel direction, and I think it will be fun to play around with that idea for Hydreigon. I've gathered so much confidence from the new way of sketching with the easy shapes. That's why I decided to use a more dynamic and difficult to replicate pose. This is something I wouldn't really do before, because I knew the possibility would be big that I would have to stop trying that pose and work on a different one. That is literally what I had to do for one of the dino pieces we made. The only thing I did have troubles with was the left head, because it took me some time to get the right perspective into it. This was mainly because I struggled to find the right direction for his open mouth, but after a little tweaking, I do think it looks pretty good. The future elements weren't necessarily difficult either, because we could just reference both the first piece and the design of Iron Jugulus. The first thing we changed were to add a few segment lines to his legs, and we brought in the rubber belly pattern between the 2 lighted parts. We then gave both necks the exact same pattern of the other Pokemon in this line, but we once again found it extremely annoying that we weren't able to give him the pixelated robotic eyes. I know the way we tried to fix it for the first stage wasn't optimal, but I really couldn't come up with a better solution, so I brought back the 2 lighted parts on the spots of his eyes. There was one thing I did for the first time ever, which was to add those hinge-like segment lines to his wings. This looked absolutely incredible together with the shading. For the colors we didn't do much differently from the first stage, and the only place I saw fit for one of those pink big lighted parts was the color around his neck. Iron Twin. This Pokemon has been optimized for regulating heat. It manages to convert harsh sunlight into pleasant shadows due to the dark energy radiating around its body. Even though this Pokemon might look menacing, it only tries to help other Pokemon and is rarely spotted without any of those Pokemon standing close by. I really like the way we utilized the new reflective lighted art technique on this piece. It really upgrades it from a robotic looking Pokemon into a Pokemon that looks like it's built out of metal. I want to start by saying that I didn't agree with the typing I gave the first stage of this line. I genuinely couldn't see the water typing in the design, so I decided to retcon it and change it into a part fire typing. This works a lot better with the chosen color palette and the lore. The drawing itself wasn't difficult at all. The only thing we had to do was to tweak his head and face shapes in order to fit the right perspective. We then just brought back the bone-like features on the top top of his head and made sure to add a few more bones scattered throughout his body to make it look like he just ate some Pokemon. You guys might be wondering if I will do the Hisuian form as well, but that thing just doesn't change enough, so I decided to bring the shell from that onto the back of this design. We did however decide to make it a bit more rugged to play into the volcanic rock aesthetic. For the colors we didn't do anything drastically different from the first stage, except for the shell, which we gave a heated up fire look by building down from orange to yellow. Dark Slime. This Pokemon is adapted to live in and around volcanoes. It sluggishly moves around the base of volcanoes, eating the magma that flows down. Its shell glows to indicate how hot it is. The more red it is, the hotter its shell. Once at max temperature, it releases plumes of lava from its shell, causing its entire body to become so hot, it instantly cooks the Pokemon it manages to trap in its body. I really like the new direction we went for this line. The fire typing fits both the lore and the looks of the Pokemon much better. I also like that the Pokemon itself looks quite friendly, but his lore is quite dark. We once again replicated the easy shapes, but this time we did it so well that I barely had to make any changes once I added in the details. For the futuristic elements, we mostly looked at the design of Iron Jelly and brought back a lot of the same elements. We started out by making his green circles on his cheek into sticking out ones, and we made sure to add the screen onto his face. We did forget to add the segment lines above the screen, but this is something we will fix later in the drawing process. After this we gave him the robotic mouth, but I will say I struggled a bit with the idea of having to pull it all the way down to the bottom of his body. We did do this for the Gumi piece, but I wasn't able to make something that looked even remotely good, so I just stopped that element at the middle of his body. We had then arrived at the usual segment line process, where we basically just add a bunch of them to block off their shapes. This always helps to build out the look of a Pokemon made out of different parts. For the shell on his back I decided to do something similar what we have done for our future form of Flareon, which was to turn it into a small reactor looking thing. I wasn't yet happy with the belly of the Pokemon, and that's why I changed it into a lighted part, almost as if the back reactor is going through its body. The colors and the rendering was where this piece shined best, so let's have a look at the end result. Iron Energy. This Pokemon is able to absorb harmful substances through the vacuum under its body and on the side of its head. It then stores those substances in the shell to slowly sterilize them, making them no longer harmful. However, it can choose to store the toxic waste in its belly to be used as an attack. I was already a big fan of the future form we made for Gumi, and I feel like this design just adds on to it perfectly. I guess the stakes are high for his final evolution now. The shape study of this piece was quite easy, but I did make a mistake for the arms. Instead of using the circles for the armor plates he has on his design, I just used the arm sizes instead. This made it difficult for me to understand where the circles had to be precisely, which resulted in a lot of tweaking later in the drawing process. During the addition of the details on top of the shapes, a feeling of an horrendous end result occurred. Luckily this wasn't actually the case, and the sketch only required some proportion and minor detail tweaking. We shortened his arms, we gave him a bigger head, made his legs a bit bigger too, and we recycled the plate on his head as well. The first thing we did for the past elements was to bring back the Ankylosaur tail by simply giving him a large rock on the tip of it. We then spent quite a lot of time adding a lot of feathers and spikes to multiple parts on his body. My biggest inspiration for this piece was still the amazing Native American aesthetic, and I tried to bring that back into this design with the feathered spikes and the feathers on the back of his head. I will say that I would have loved it to add more spiky feather elements into the design, but the design already was quite busy and I didn't want to make the design feel over designed. The final details we brought onto the piece were the makeup under the eye, and we changed the plate on his head into a rock as well. The colors remained completely the same, however I did actually want to make the red spot on his arm feel a lot more like a crystal, but now that I actually look at it, I genuinely failed at that. Polished plate. This Pokemon strongly believes in strength in numbers. Many polished blades will stand side by side with the arms up to form a great wall, to either slow approach their opponent or to protect their vulnerable members. It groups up with others of its kind to perform a sacred ritual by clanging their skills together. The reason they do this is not clear, but it is speculated that this ritual blesses them with great prosperity. Even though I'm still not a huge fan of the original Pokemon in this line, I am really happy with the design direction we're taking these in. For the pose we referenced for this piece, he had one open hand and the other one showed all of the plates. This time we did actually use those shapes in our study, and it really showed to be a lot more effective. The most fun thing about seeing all of these shape studies is that a lot of these designs are mainly built out of a lot of spheres, combined with some simple lines in between of them. I can't wait for the day that we have perfected this sketching technique and apply it to our own unique poses. For the future elements, we started with a line in his eye socket to emulate some depth into it. We then blocked off his jaw and added some tiny teeth onto them as well. After this, we spent some time working on his legs, which we gave some segment lines, and we added a hinge into the right one. We also segmented his feet so we could use two different colors on them. The other changes weren't anything special either, and we just added a few segments in his tail and arm, plus we added a bunch of depth into the middle part of his body. The color palette remained completely the same due to the part electric typing, but I will say it was weird to figure out what to do with it shiny, because every single part of his body was already grey. This made it difficult to see which parts I had to replace and which ones needed to stay the same. Iron Armor. This Pokemon spends most of its time gathering food to eat in order to strengthen its skills. Once it has been able to strengthen its skills to the maximum level, it starts non-stop training in order to reach their final evolution. I'm still a huge fan of the jaw we added into this piece. It isn't as extreme as it was for Iron Thorns, but it does help to make the design feel a lot stronger and more interesting in general. I absolutely loved the design we made for Dreepy, so I was eager to transform this Pokemon as well. The sketch actually went by decently quickly. We picked a super interesting pose which we found on a certain Pokemon card and put down the easy shapes plus the details. The only thing that took me a while was to get the eyes to fit the face. This is one of those things that will always remain a struggle, because only one of them has to look slightly off and it will ruin the other one as well. Once we managed to get them to look the way we wanted, we started with the past elements. We did of course continue the inspiration from Dia de los Muertos, and we began by adding in the spikes on his head crests. We then brought back a lot of the feathers on his tail and also on the edges of the head crests as well. After this, we made sure to change his arms into sharp and creepier looking ones, and we added back in the small teeth. I wasn't able to find the right spot for more bones on his tail, and I do think this makes the tail look a bit too empty now, but it is what it is, I guess. The regular design has a Dreepy hanging on the top of his head, but I decided to change that into a little soul creature, which would work great for his lore, and yeah, it was easier to draw too. For the colors, we once again used a different color palette than his original one, but we did bring it back for a shiny. Reaping Guide. This Pokemon guides deceased spirits towards the afterlife, but they only do it for a certain exchange. The spirit on his head must guide it towards any weak and injured prey. This makes it so Reaping Guides rarely go without a meal, and the spirits reach the afterlife safely. I really like how creepy this Pokemon looks now. The changed arms definitely help on that department, although I do still think that his tail looks a bit too empty right now. I will start out by saying that I didn't really enjoy working on this piece. At first it wasn't really an issue, but then I remembered that I would also have to include the Dreepy into this design. The sketch itself went by pretty nicely, but the drawing just looked a bit weird, and I wasn't able to fix this for the entire drawing process. Now that I look at it while writing the script, I can see that I drew his body too round-like, which makes it look too similar to a Muppet. The futuristic elements of the design weren't an issue, but for the Dreepy in the design I opted to go into a mothership route and gave the design 2 holes in its chest to shoot them out of. Does this look great? No, not really. I'm just not really a fan of this line in general, which probably has resulted in me not caring too much about it either. I did have some fun with the colors, and not because they are so different from the regular one, but because it was fun to mix the different colors from both the stages into one. Iron Mothership. This Pokemon carries around its young, but it doesn't do it for kind purposes. It shoots them into battle for own gain and won't hesitate to sacrifice one of its offspring to get out of tough situations. Although this might seem like a horrible action, Iron Missile seems to enjoy serving its parent and follows up orders without questioning. I just don't know about this design. I will also admit that I even forgot to shade the lighted parts at first, and this made me reanimate the piece as well. I am sorry for this abomination, guys. I once again managed to find an interesting but difficult to make pose, but as I told you guys earlier, we're not backing down for those anymore. I figured I would have had some issues with the sizes of everything, but to my surprise our first sketch was already pretty great. The only thing we had to work on again was his mouth, because I really don't know why it happens, but my faces turn out to look like Muppets if I'm not careful. This might be my subconsciousness wanting to create Pokemon Muppets, since I've already named a few of them after Muppets too. Once we reached the point of the paradox elements, I looked back at the first piece and I noticed that I didn't have too many changes on it. This is because the entire line already looks quite dinosaur-like, and the only thing I tried to do was to add even more feral features onto it. For this middle stage I repeated a lot of those elements, like the chips in his back spike, the spikes on his knees and tail, the fiery ribbons on his arms, and we made his mouth pointier too. The last detail we worked on was adding some height to a lot of the icy elements on his design. I figured this would make the design look a bit more rugged, which helps for the feral look we're going for. The colors remained completely the same, except for his shiny, which we completely changed into a crocodile color palette. We even changed the color of his eyes to resemble radioactiveness, because it already looks quite similar to Godzilla. Koopa Troopa. This Pokemon can use its stomach furnace to set its dorsal fin ablaze. This helps to keep its children warm when living in harsh snowstorms. Koopa Troopa can also freeze its dorsal fin until it turns to ice, making it a blade to cut his foes. The wounds it makes can only be healed by the best healers out there. I am really happy with the end result of this dude. It is such a simple change, but it makes him look a lot more powerful and rough. The pose is also absolutely incredible, so credits to the artist who came up with it for the official Pokemon card I referenced. Our last drawing of today is of course the future form of Arctibax. For this piece we decided to go with the regular pose, because there literally only was one other left to pick from. This is the case because it's obviously a new Pokemon, but I do kinda like the regular pose, so it's fine. I know I've said it a few times already now, but this is insane. Literally the only thing I had to change from adding in the details was to make his face elements slightly bigger. The rest was already in the exact way I wanted them. I definitely realized that this wasn't necessarily the hardest pose to replicate, but with the ease I was able to make it, I actually blew myself away. For the future elements we started by closing off both his arms and legs to give the look of being made out of parts. We followed that up by making segments in each of his legs and by adding some other segment lines on both types of his limbs. After adding one segment to the tip of his tail and two basic segment lines on his back, we moved our focus towards his facial area. We made sure to make his jaw a bit sturdy and blockier, and we added some nostrils to the front of it. We also added one tiny square of lighted part on it, plus we added a segment of lighted part on his forehead. Once we were happy with these elements, we added his final details like some refined forms on his back spikes, and we managed to bring in a big belly patch on the frontal part of his body. Iron Raptor. This Pokemon is a common house pet for children and adults alike. While it isn't your typical dog, it is a very low maintenance pet perfect for irresponsible children. Iron Raptor can store much larger items in his body now that it has evolved, serving as an extra bag to carry luggage. This is really one of my better drawings I've done. The only thing I would probably still need to work on for this design is to make his eye a little bit bigger, because this does feel a little bit bit too realistic compared to the regular design. A bigger eye would definitely make it look a lot closer to the cartoony style of Pokemon. Well, these are all the second stage Pseudo Legendaries. Let me know which design was your favorite, and goodbye!